When investigators finally traced the sound, they realized it wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from beneath it. And what they found was something no one on the team had been trained to understand. They believed at first it was a damaged pipe, a fault in the foundation, maybe even an old generator deep underground. But when the first audio specialist listened to the recording, the one recovered from the victim's phone, he stepped back from the speakers with a look no one could explain. 3 seconds. That's all the recording contained. 3 seconds. That changed the entire direction of the case. The waveform didn't match any machinery, any animal, any known pattern. Every expert who examined it gave the same response: quiet, hesitant, uneasy. One of them finally muttered, "Whatever made that sound wasn't supposed to exist." And that was before the investigators found the second recording. A recording that should never have been captured, because the victim was already gone when it was made. This is the case that forced entire departments to recheck their archives. The case that reopened files previously dismissed as accidents and revealed a pattern that stretches farther back than anyone expected. And tonight, you're going to hear why the lead detective stopped the inquiry, walked out of the building, and never returned to the force. Everything begins with that sound, and the moment it was traced to the ground beneath the house. The case begins in the colder months of 2019, in a remote settlement along the northern ridgeline, where only a handful of homes sit scattered across uneven ground. A place where the nights stretch longer than the days, and where sound carries farther than it should. A single resident, Daniel Aaron, lived at the edge of that ridge. 36 years old. A field sound archivist who spent most of his days restoring damaged recordings. He kept to himself, worked from home, and rarely traveled farther than the nearest store. Neighbors described his home as quiet, dark windows, a single antenna mounted on the roof for his equipment. Nothing unusual. But 3 weeks before investigators entered that house, Daniel received a package. A plain cardboard parcel left by someone who never used the front path. Inside was an old field recorder. Scuffed, mud on the battery panel. Still switched on. Daniel assumed someone found it on a trail and wanted it returned. He mentioned it casually to a colleague. Nothing concerning. But the first sign something was wrong appeared that same evening, only hours after the recorder arrived. Daniel reported hearing a faint knock under the floorboards. Just once. He dismissed it as settling wood in cold weather. Yet the sound returned the next night. And the night after that. Always from the same spot, always at the same time. Daniel didn't know it then, but the knocks matched the rhythm in the 3-second recording found later by investigators. And that was the moment the calm life he kept so carefully began to slip out of view. Over the next several days, Daniel began paying closer attention to the sounds beneath his home. At first, it was single knocks, spaced far apart. But by the end of the week, the pattern shifted. The knocks came in pairs, then in clusters. Each time, the volume increased by the smallest degree, barely noticeable unless you recorded it. But that wasn't the strange part. Daniel noticed that the sounds rose through the floor at the exact moment his field recorder powered off on its own. He didn't touch it. He didn't even keep it near him. Yet every time the recorder shut down, the knocking followed. He assumed it was a technical glitch. He replaced the batteries. He tested the wiring. Nothing changed. However, something still didn't make sense. One night, well after midnight, Daniel decided to trace the sound more carefully. He placed monitoring microphones around the house, one near the hallway, one in the kitchen, one just above the basement hatch. He set the recorder to run for 6 hours. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. Only one microphone picked up anything unusual. The one above the basement hatch. But the waveform showed no knock. No movement. Just a single tone, a low, steady hum that faded in and out at irregular intervals. Yet the tone shouldn't have been possible. The basement had no power supply. Later that week, Daniel began noticing small changes around his property. Indentations in the ground leading toward his house, too narrow for boots, too straight for animal tracks. A thin trail of disturbed soil that stopped directly under his bedroom window. He asked a neighbor if they'd seen anyone passing through the yard. No one had. But that wasn't the only detail that raised concern. Twice, Daniel woke up to find his front gate standing open. He always locked it. He checked the latch in daylight to be sure it wasn't faulty. It held firm. Then he found something new. On the fourth morning, he discovered a folded piece of paper tucked under a potted plant near the steps. Blank. No message. No markings. As if someone wanted to leave a sign without saying anything. And while he was trying to understand that, another problem appeared. Until one night, the sound changed entirely. Just after 2:00 a.m., Daniel woke to what he described later as a drawn-out echo. Not a knock. Not a footstep. Something stretched, like a distant call bouncing through a long, empty tunnel. It repeated 3 times. Each repetition slightly more focused than the last. As if something below the house was learning his layout. He turned on every light and checked all doors. Nothing had moved. Nothing was missing. No signs of entry. However, there was something he couldn't explain. In the morning, he listened to the recordings again. This time, the microphones captured the echo clearly. And beneath the echo, barely audible, was a second layer, something soft, almost like fabric brushing against a hard surface. He played it back, again and again. And on the 6th playback, he heard it. A voice. Faint, almost swallowed by the hum. A whisper that lasted a fraction of a second. Daniel couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like someone calling from behind a wall. But that wasn't what alarmed him most. When he checked the metadata on the file, it showed the recording time as 3:17 a.m. Daniel had checked the house at 2:00 a.m. He hadn't heard the whisper then, but the microphone had. 2 days later, the case took a turn investigators would focus on for months. A local hiker, who walked the ridge trail regularly, was reported missing. Her last known message to a friend mentioned hearing echoes near the old weather station. That message was sent 9 minutes before her phone stopped transmitting. However, a troubling link was discovered. The missing hiker passed within half a mile of Daniel's home on the night she vanished. Her GPS showed a pause near the property line. Just under 2 minutes. No one knows why she stopped, or why she turned off her flashlight immediately afterward. Authorities searched the ridge for 3 days. They found no footprints beyond her last known marker. No struggle. No equipment left behind. Just silence. Until investigators checked Daniel's recordings from that same night. Exactly 9 minutes before her phone went offline, his basement microphone picked up the same 3-second echo that later appeared on her device. Same pattern. Same frequency. Same rising fade at the end. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, this was the first confirmed connection between his home and the disappearance. And that's when he contacted the authorities. When the authorities reviewed Daniel's recordings alongside the missing hiker's audio file, they called in specialists, acoustic analysts, behavioral scientists, and 2 consultants who studied unusual auditory patterns linked to high-stress events. Their assessments pushed the case into new territory. One of the behavioral consultants, Dr. Lee Corburn, focused on a question that guided much of the investigation. Human or not, every action follows a pattern, and patterns reveal intent. Dr. Corburn pointed out that the echo in Daniel's recordings showed a repeating method. 3 pulses, a pause, then a final drawn-out tone. This sequence resembled a type of probing behavior. Not communication, not warning. More like someone, or something, mapping a space through repeated sound. The way it timed itself, the way it adjusted in volume, the way it changed direction. These are traits seen in individuals who lack visual cues and rely on sound to understand their environment. But that wasn't the observation that raised the most concern. Patterns like this appear in people who have spent long periods in isolation, individuals who lost stable contact with others and developed compensatory behaviors to navigate dark or confined surroundings. In multiple disappearance cases near the ridge, witnesses who reported hearing the echo described a similar bodily reaction. A tightening in the chest, difficulty focusing, and a strong urge to remain still. These reactions align with something researchers call the echo response, a fear reflex seen when the brain receives sound that does not match the environment. When the mind can't classify a sound quickly, it shifts into alertness. Breathing slows. Attention narrows. Decision-making becomes impaired. However, there was a deeper implication. If the sound was specifically crafted or evolved to trigger that reflex, the cause might be an entity familiar with how humans react to certain frequencies. Not through design, but through repetition. Meaning the pattern may have been learned over time. Investigators built a timeline for previous missing individuals in the region. Records, journals, and old police reports revealed an unexpected trend. Most victims reported changes in mood or behavior in the days before they vanished. Difficulty sleeping, trouble concentrating, a sense of being watched, or an urge to check certain parts of their homes repeatedly. These aren't random symptoms. They match early-stage auditory fixation, where a person becomes increasingly aware of a repeating sound, even if it is faint. But that wasn't the only similarity. Each individual mentioned hearing something just before disappearing. Some called it a call. Others described it as a hollow voice. One man wrote that it sounded like someone packing beneath the ground. None of them treated it as a threat at first. Most assumed it was plumbing, wind, or distant construction. In their interview with Daniel, investigators noticed the early signs themselves. He had begun checking his basement hatch multiple times a night. He kept his curtains closed, even during the day. His replies to questions grew slower, as if he were listening for something behind the walls. He spoke about the echo, as if it were following a routine. He claimed it shifted direction, depending on where he stood. He said it almost felt aware. Experts reviewing the interview noted this shift carefully. Paranoia doesn't appear instantly. It builds through small, repetitive stimuli. And the echo, with its changing pattern, created the exact conditions needed for that response. However, one detail in Daniel's mental state stood apart from the others. He wasn't afraid in the way most victims become. He was focused, almost drawn to the sound, as if something about it held his attention beyond reason. One theory suggests a human origin. Someone who lived underground or in isolation long enough to adapt to moving through darkness using reflected sound. This kind of adaptation appears in rare cases among people who retreat from society and exist in abandoned structures, caves, or old facilities. Extended isolation can sharpen hearing to unusual levels. A person living that way might learn to navigate by echo alone and might approach homes not to harm, but to observe. But experts found an issue with that explanation. The echo in the recordings didn't match the timing of natural footsteps or vocal reflections. It moved too quickly between surfaces, too precisely, as if bouncing from fixed points with no delay. No human produces that kind of controlled reflection without equipment. Then there was the second theory, one investigators rarely discuss publicly. If the echo wasn't produced by a person, it may have come from a natural phenomenon shaped over decades. A resonance formed in underground chambers, amplified by shifting stone, pressure, and temperature. A type of sound that behaves like an approaching presence, even though nothing is physically there. Yet this explanation also had gaps. Natural resonance doesn't adjust its pattern in response to movement. It doesn't mimic voices. And it doesn't appear at the same time across multiple locations. Which led to the final question investigators struggled to answer. Every victim heard it shortly before disappearing. Every recording captured its shifts in tone and packing. Every trace showed it moving closer, but never the direction from which it came. Some experts believe it adapted toward human attention, pulling focus, creating fixation, causing people to investigate, step outside, or approach an opening in the floor. A sound that encourages curiosity is more dangerous than one that signals danger. And that behavioral pattern, more than anything else, shaped the next phase of the investigation and the discovery that awaited Daniel in his basement. In the days after his interview with investigators, Daniel grew increasingly unsettled inside his own home. The echo no longer appeared only at night. Short pulses sounded in the early morning, then again near dusk, as if the timing no longer depended on his movement, but on something beneath the floor adjusting its approach. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom, started working at his kitchen table, headphones on, trying to drown out the faint hum that drifted through the house at irregular intervals. The investigation team installed motion sensors inside the home after noticing the correlation between the missing hiker's last location and the timing of Daniel's recordings. They placed microphones along the walls, a ground sensor near the basement hatch, and a small camera in the hallway. For 2 days, nothing unusual happened. No movement. No knocks. Only the low hum, rising and falling with no pattern. Then came the third night. Just after 1:00 a.m., the hallway camera detected a vibration traveling along the floorboards. Not a tremor. Not a shift in temperature. A precise vibration, moving in a straight line from the back of the house toward the basement hatch. At the same moment, the basement microphone captured 3 pulses. Then a pause. Then a longer tone, almost identical to the pattern heard on the hiker's device. But the vibration wasn't what caught the investigators' attention. The ground sensor showed the vibration rising upward, as if something was climbing from a lower level. Yet the property records confirmed there was no lower level. No tunnel. No crawl space. No access point except the foundation beams. This prompted the team to open the basement, something Daniel had avoided for days. The hatch resisted at first, as if pressure had built underneath it. When it finally opened, a rush of cold air escaped. The investigators descended a short set of steps into a narrow, unfinished room lit only by a single overhead bulb. Dust covered most surfaces. Old storage boxes. A collapsed shelf. Nothing that suggested recent activity. But the concrete floor showed faint markings, lines curved in arcs, as if made by something dragged repeatedly across the ground. Yet the lines didn't match any tool, furniture leg, or known object. As they examined the floor, one of the analysts noticed a section of the wall near the far corner where the paint had thinned. A thin vertical seam, almost invisible unless light struck it at an angle. He pressed on it. Nothing moved. He pressed again, along the lower half. Still nothing. Then Daniel stepped forward and tapped it with his knuckles. A hollow response. Investigators returned with thermal imaging. Behind the concrete wall, a temperature gradient indicated open space, wider than the basement itself. Someone had sealed off an entire section of the foundation. It took nearly an hour for them to safely break through the outer layer. Beneath it, they found a metal door. Heavy, cold, with no handle. Only a narrow gap at the bottom allowed air to move in and out. What came through that gap shifted the entire direction of the investigation. The moment the first crack opened, a long, trailing echo drifted out. Not from speakers, not from a device, from inside the sealed room itself. The frequency matched the recordings. After prying the door open, they aimed a flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a corridor, narrow, walls lined with thick acoustic foam. The foam was old, peeling, some pieces crumbled to dust. Farther inside, the investigators discovered a small chamber. Square, unfinished, empty except for a chair placed in the center. The chair was metal, bolted to the floor, stained at the base by years of damp air. A single microphone hung from the ceiling above it, dangling, disconnected, yet still intact. But the recordings found inside the chamber told a deeper story. On the far wall, a set of shelves held a stack of audio reels, some labeled, some blank, some warped beyond use. The labels were dated between 1983 and 2008. Each label followed the same pattern. Sample A, Sample A2, Sample A3. 27 variations, all marked with the same letter. Someone, decades earlier, had been documenting the echo. Archived records later identified the homeowner who built the chamber. A researcher named Philip Marrow, an acoustic theorist who vanished in 2008. His final project proposal referenced a persistent resonance in the ridge, one he claimed could repeat human sounds with uncanny accuracy. He believed the resonance was not random. He believed it responded to movement, to attention. But his last note raised the most concern. In the margins of his final entry, he wrote, "If the echo repeats your voice, do not reply." No further documents were found. As investigators examined the room, Daniel remained near the doorway, listening. He said later he felt something, an impression, moving just behind the walls. Not footsteps, something slower. When he stepped toward the chair, the microphone above it swayed slightly. No wind, no draft, just a faint sway. And then the tone returned. A long, rising sound that filled the chamber from every direction. It vibrated through the metal bolts, traveled up the chair legs, and settled in the ceiling panels. But this time, it didn't sound like a tone. It sounded like breathing. One of the investigators found an unlabeled reel near the bottom of the shelf. Dust-covered, warped along the edges. He set it on a portable player, rewound it, and pressed play. At first, the room filled with static. Then a slow pattern emerged. 3 pulses. A pause. Another tone. Then a voice, very faint, layered beneath the hum. Not Philip Marrow's voice. Not Daniel. Not any victim on record. The voice repeated a single word. A word investigators could barely distinguish through the interference. A word that sounded like, "Here." And Daniel turned toward the far wall because he heard the response from the other side. When the team attempted to trace the source of the sound, the instruments failed to pinpoint a precise origin. Every reading showed movement, yet no visible object. Inside the chamber, the echo drifted from the floor to the corner, then upward toward the ceiling beams. It grew clearer, more focused, almost aligned with the breathing pattern heard earlier. And then the chair moved. It shifted a few centimeters across the floor, metal scraping against concrete. The sound matched the arcs investigators saw earlier. No one was near it. Daniel stepped back toward the door. The echo followed him, short pulses that matched his steps, as if the sound were packing in tandem. And when he stopped, the pulses stopped. Investigators reached one conclusion. Whatever produced the echo did not exist as a visible form. It behaved like a presence learned over time, taking in sound, releasing it, adjusting it, repeating it with growing precision. It had been responding to the people who entered the chamber, to their movement, to their breathing, and to their voices. When Daniel whispered to the lead investigator, asking if they should leave, the chamber repeated his whisper exactly, 2 seconds after he spoke. Perfect pitch. Perfect timing. No distortion. And that is when the team understood. The chamber wasn't designed to trap anything. It was designed to observe it. As the investigators prepared to exit, the last microphone flickered. A 3-second pattern played through it, identical to the one found on the missing hiker's device. Then a new sound layered beneath it. A voice, clearer than any previous recording. Daniel's voice. But Daniel hadn't spoken. The echo repeated his words before he could form them, as if speaking ahead of him. As if anticipating what he was going to say. And that moment marked the point where the investigation crossed into territory no one could explain, and the point where Daniel's involvement in the case took a turn investigators still refused to discuss. The investigation team left the chamber just before sunrise. No one speaks much during that walk back up the stairs. There's a silence investigators fall into when they've witnessed something they were never trained to categorize. Daniel stayed behind for a moment at the basement door. He said he needed to breathe, to reorient, though his hands never left the railing. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected the echo to follow. And many who reviewed the footage later wondered, maybe it did. In the days after the chamber was uncovered, Daniel's behavior began to shift. Not drastically. Not enough for anyone to intervene. But enough for those around him to notice subtle changes. He paused before responding to ordinary questions, like he was waiting for something else to answer first. He began checking the corners of every room, quietly, discreetly, before speaking on the phone. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he tapped the wall beside him. 3 times. A pause. Then once more. Investigators asked if he was hearing the echo again. He always said no. But recordings from his home suggested otherwise. The surveillance devices placed earlier, scheduled for removal, captured one final audio file before the batteries died. It was recorded at 3:17 a.m. Daniel wasn't in the basement. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even awake. The house was still. And yet the microphone in the sealed chamber, now broken open and empty, captured a single whisper. One word. Not Daniel's voice. Not any investigators. A whisper saying, "Closer." And then the microphone fell from the ceiling, even though the room was completely still. Within a week, the research facility withdrew from the case entirely. Official statements cited structural anomalies and data inconsistencies. Unofficially, the team stopped answering questions. The missing hiker's family received a brief update. The audio on his device could not be matched to any known environmental pattern. They were told the search had no new leads. But off-camera, several investigators admitted something quietly disturbing. The tone on the hiker's device matched the earliest tapes recorded by Philip Merrow. Exactly. Same frequency. Same rhythm. And Merrow vanished nearly 2 decades before the hiker ever stepped into those woods. Daniel eventually stopped contacting the investigative team. He took time off work, avoided interviews, changed his daily routes. Neighbors said he developed a habit of sleeping in different rooms, always with the door open. And occasionally, in the middle of the night, they heard tapping through the walls. 3 taps. A pause. 1 tap. He never explained the pattern. Not once. By the end of the month, the property was marked as unsafe. Contractors were brought in to reinforce the foundation. The chamber was filled, concrete poured into every crevice. New floorboards. New supports. No trace of the metal door or the acoustic foam remained. At least, not visibly. But one of the contractors reported something he couldn't quite shake off. He said he heard a sound while pouring the final section. A slow, muffled vibration. Like something underneath, the concrete was adjusting its position. He told his supervisor. The supervisor told him to keep working. And by the next day, the contractor refused to return to the site. A month later, during a follow-up interview, Daniel was shown the final audio recording, the one captured in the chamber while he slept. The whisper. The word, closer. He listened without speaking. His face stayed completely still. Then he asked a question that startled the lead investigator. He asked, "Are you sure that was from the basement?" The investigator said yes. Daniel shook his head. Softly, barely noticeable. And he whispered, "Because I think I heard it last night, from the ceiling." When investigators returned with fresh equipment, they found the house empty. Furniture gone. Utilities shut off. No forwarding address. On the living room wall, someone had left a message, written lightly in dust. It wasn't a sentence, just a pattern. 3 vertical lines. A gap. Then one more. The same pattern Daniel had been tapping. But here's the detail that disturbed the team most. Dust had been dragged downward from the lines, as if the markings were made from inside the wall, pushing outward. The case file remains open. Not active. Just open. A formality for cases where nothing fits a defined category. No official cause for the chamber's original construction. No confirmation of what produced the echoes. No trace of where Daniel went. And no explanation for why the voice on the final tape matched a frequency first recorded decades ago. To this day, no one knows who or what the voice belonged to. Some investigators believe there was never a presence in the chamber. Only sound bouncing in ways we don't yet understand. Others believe the resonance was responding to attention, growing sharper with every person who stepped inside, every voice it captured, every breath it memorized. And a few still swear the echo wasn't repeating their voices, but learning them. The property has a new owner now, a quiet individual who declined interviews. 2 weeks after moving in, they made a single maintenance request. A complaint about faint tapping in the walls. 3 taps. A pause. Then 1. When workers arrived, the homeowner said the tapping stopped the moment they entered, but resumed the moment they left. They called again the following week. And this time, they said the tapping didn't sound like it came from the walls at all. A pause. A breath. They said it sounded like it was coming from just behind their voice when they spoke. So that's where the file ends. A missing archivist, a chamber that should never have existed, and a pattern that keeps returning in places it has no reason to appear. Some investigators insist the case is closed enough. Others say it feels like something waiting, something unfinished. And then there are those who believe the sound recorded in that house wasn't a signal, but an invitation. If you want this case revisited, if you think more of the older files should be opened, you already know what to do. Or maybe you heard something in this story that the investigators missed. If that's the case, leave your thoughts where the rest of us can study them. And if you were the one living in that house, if those echoes followed you the way they followed Daniel, how long would you have stayed before walking out into the night? Or would you have stayed at all? Whichever side you fall on, the team is reviewing the next collection of tapes. And if anything in them connects to the pattern found here, you'll hear about it sooner than you think. Until then, keep an ear out for sounds that don't belong. They have a way of repeating, long after the source is gone.